a wonderful joy to be back in Seattle. And what I mean by that is I actually did my university studies here in the Seattle area, not at UW, but on Queen Anne Hill at SPU, although I often found my way over to the UW because the library at the UW was far better than the library that we had at SPU, especially in the area that I was studying. I got my degree at SPU in history with a special emphasis on Sino-American relations. And there was not a whole lot of material at the SPU library for that. I needed to come over to the UW, and I found my way over to the UW library on many occasions to do study and to do research. It's a special joy for Mimi and I to be back here in the Seattle area, although for just a very short time. Actually, we are members of OMF, serving in Asia. I've been a part of OMF since 1990, so just about 25 years serving with OMF. And presently we are living in Hong Kong with a special focus upon China as well as the Chinese world. Just by way of a more personal side, we have 3 kids, 1 boy and 2 girls. The boy, you don't need a whole lot of imagination to come up with his name. You just change the number at the end. My grandfather was James Hudson Taylor II. My father was the 3rd, I'm the 4th. And he is the 5th. He's not quite got up to Henry VIII. But we're actually trusting the Lord will return before then. But anyway. And then we have 2 younger daughters. Well, they are still younger. They're in their late teens. Our second daughter, Selena, actually named after the Duchess of Huntington. If any of you are fans of church history, you'll know that the Wesley brothers, as well as George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, this was back a long, long time ago. But during the Great Awakening in the 17th century, there was a lady by the name of Selena, and she was a duchess. And she was very supportive of the Wesley brothers and their work with the Great Revival. And so that was the name that we gave to our second daughter, because I'm a history fan. And then our youngest one, who is a junior in high school in Taiwan, is named Joy. And so we have 3 kids to this party of 5, but just the 2 of us here. This is actually a 3-stop trip for us on the west coast of the United States. Seattle is our first stop, so you're getting us all very fresh. By San Francisco next weekend, we'll be ready to head home. But in the middle, we'll be in Los Angeles as well. Actually, not only has this been sort of a whirlwind, or will be a whirlwind, this whole year seems to be a whirlwind, at least for us. As many of you know, this year is the 150th anniversary of the founding of the China Inland Mission, founded by my great-great-grandfather, Hudson Taylor, in 1865. All the missionaries eventually had to leave China by the early 1950s, and we began to branch out into other parts of Asia. The name was changed from the China Inland Mission to China Inland Mission, OMF, Overseas Missionary Fellowship, in the middle 1960s. And then in the 1990s, inasmuch as it didn't look like we were going to get back into China, at least not in a very visible way, the name then just went with OMF International. And this year we're visiting some 16 countries as a part of a year of, we've labeled 3 terms for this year. One is to remember, the second is to rejoice, and then the third is to renew. That in this year we are trusting that the Lord will allow us to remember the past and to be thankful for that and rejoice to God in it, but also to renew ourselves, committing ourselves afresh to the Great Commission and to see the fulfillment of the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. We began this year actually in the country of Indonesia. And it was a special joy to travel to Indonesia to visit some of the work that actually we began in the 1950s when all the missionaries had to leave China And actually at that point it was a very critical juncture in the mission, because there were some who felt that the vision was for China, and inasmuch as China was closed, would it not be actually right also for the mission to also stop? But after prayerful reflection and discussion, the Lord led the mission at that point to see that right across Asia there were many, many countries where there were large pockets of Chinese. And so the decision was made that instead of ending the mission, that we would refocus ourselves. And one of the early countries we went to actually was the country of Indonesia. And our early work in Indonesia was based in West Kalimantan. And it was a wonderful joy for us to go and visit there in the early part of this year in January, sort of the kickoff for a whole year of remembering, rejoicing, and renewing. And probably what stuck most in my mind in that trip was, while we were in Kalimantan, we went to a city called Pontianak. And some of you might be familiar with the geography of Indonesia. It's quite a ways out of the way, very difficult to get to. But one of the memorable experiences of our time there was the local committee that was hosting us took us to visit the gravesite of a OMF missionary, a couple, by the name of Don and Sylvia Huliston. They were from South Africa. The Lord called them to the mission, the China Inland Mission, and they were sent to Pontianak, to West Kalimantan, to work among the Chinese there. As we were gathering around that tomb and their gravesite, I asked those who went with us, and there was about 40, I asked them to share some of their impressions, and some of them still remember Don and Sylvia Huliston. Actually, I remember meeting them in the early 1980s. This was after I finished at SPU, and the Lord called me actually to serve for 2 years with OMF down in California, in Berkeley. And I had the joy of working alongside a great man of God by the name of David Aidney. Now, some of you, that name might ring a bell for some of you, and in fact, some might be related to David Aidney. And it was a wonderful joy. 2 years for me to work with Mr. Aidney, a Cambridge graduate who married an American from Minnesota, and after they retired, they moved here to the Northwest, they moved down to California and lived in Berkeley. What always struck me about Mr. Aidney is he learned his Chinese in the central part of China. Now, some of you might be familiar with Chinese, and you'll know that it is a tonal language. And if your tones are off, then you're in a bit of a trouble. So, in other words, as an example, if you use this tone ma, there are 4 tones to this sound. Ma, 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 ma. And in its first tone, ma, it actually is a reference to mother. So you would call your mom mama. But if you don't get your tones right, you're not calling your mom mom, you're rather calling her a horse. Which I'm not sure mothers would appreciate being calling horses. But actually another one that I always enjoyed ribbing Mr. Aidney on is the word Lord, which in Chinese is zhu. It's the 3rd tone. But Mr. Aidney, with his Henan accent, always mixed it up. And so instead of saying zhu, the 3rd tone, he would always say zhu, the 1st tone, which actually, if you know Chinese, means pig. So Mr. Aidney would always pray, "Dear Pig," and I was a really obnoxious college graduate, and I would always rib him and say, "Mr. Aidney, it's not zhu, it's zhu." Anyway, a little language lesson on the side. But I remember in those 2 years I had the chance of meeting Don and Sylvia Huliston from South Africa. Well, eventually the Lord took them back to South Africa. They retired there, and just several years ago they passed away. But the request that they had was that they would be cremated and their ashes would be taken back to Pontianak and they would be buried in Indonesia. And I remember standing there, and I asked the people to share what their impressions would be of Mr. and Mrs. or Don and Sylvia Huliston. And some of them, as I mentioned, remembered him. But one of the things one person said was, Don always had a heart for evangelism. And so he would always go into the Chinese market there in Pontianak. And his form of evangelism was singing. And so he would sing John 3:16, God so loved the world, set to a Chinese tune. He would walk up and down this market singing this song. And of course, here is this Caucasian singing in Chinese, and that was the attraction, of course. Why can you sing Chinese or speak Chinese? And so that became a magnet and an opportunity for him to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. But that was what they shared about. What struck me, of course, obviously, was here was a couple with a heart for Asia, to such a point that even after their death, their desire was that their ashes would be taken back to Asia, back to Indonesia, back to West Kalimantan, back to Pontianak, and they would be buried there. And so it started out as a wonderful year, and we're trusting the Lord will lead us forward. I'd like to share this afternoon a little bit of history, but I'd like to also couch it in some missional lessons from the CIM that we can learn from as we look at missions in the 21st century. And I'd like to use 5 P's to sort of couch what I'd like to share with you this afternoon. But before those 5 P's, maybe I can just give you a little bit of a background, especially if you're not as familiar with the life of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was born in the middle of the 19th century. He was born in 1832. And at the ripe age of 21, he left England and set out for China on a ship. And it took him 163 days for him to go from Liverpool, England, to Shanghai. 163 days. Now, let me just pause there very quickly, because I think there is a very important thing for us to also realize, that actually in this day and age of the convenience of transportation, the expansion of missions is greatly enhanced. And what I mean by that is what took Hudson Taylor and those early missionaries 163 days to do, you and I can actually do in half a day. In other words, we could fly from Heathrow, London. We could fly from Heathrow right across Asia and land in Shanghai in just about 12, perhaps 13 hours. So what those early missionaries took half a year to do, you and I can do in half a day. And I've often wondered what those early missionaries would think of the day and age that you and I live in. And I think 2 things at least that come to mind. Obviously, one, they would be very envious of this generation. And the convenience of well, let me just instantly interject. Because of it, the fact it took them 163 days, if you go and look at mission literature of that day, you will find that this word short-term did not exist back in Hudson Taylor's day. And of course, that's understandable, because it was 163 days there, it was 163 days back. So short-term did not exist then. But by God's grace, and I thank God for short-term missionaries. Actually, within OMF, we recently did a survey, and we determined that actually nearly 80% of OMFers, people who eventually go long-term in terms of mission, actually began that experience on short-term missions. And so I think there's a strategic role to play in short-term missions, although short-term missions should not be an end in itself. And that's a whole other topic we don't need to get in this afternoon. But the other thing that I thought of is I'm pretty sure that they would thoroughly reprimand this generation. And what I mean by that is simply this, that it is so easy for us to do missions, why aren't we doing more of it? And so it took him 163 days before he got to China. Well, he spent the next nearly 7 years in the Shanghai area, serving and doing evangelism. And there's many lessons, actually I'll share in a little bit, that were gleaned from that experience. But eventually he met his wife Maria in the city of Ningbo, which is just south of Shanghai. And they were married, and several years later they returned to England in 1860. And Hudson Taylor and Maria and the family spent the next 5 years in England, actually, originally they went back to England a bit discouraged and disappointed because they felt, well, why, with such fruitful work taking place in Asia, in China, why is God bringing us back to England? Or why is God taking us back to England? Actually, Hudson Taylor's health was failing, and that was the primary reason. But it was interesting, if we went back and looked at that period of time, we would see that while they were discouraged, actually God's invisible hand was at work. And there was a purpose for him to go back, or for them to be back in England during that time. Well, while they were there, he first of all completed his medical degree, which he actually cut short because the mission agency that he was originally with was so anxious to get Hudson Taylor to China that they sent him off in 1853, as we've already mentioned. So he was able to complete his medical degree. Secondly, he did a very interesting thing. He worked together with several colleagues on the translation of the Bible into the Ningbo dialect. Now, some of you will be more familiar with this, but China is a multi-dialect nation. And so you can go to different parts of the country, and they have different dialects. Of course, today as we go to China, it's a lot easier because they all speak Mandarin Chinese. That is something that Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, put in implemented to allow for an integration of the country. And incidentally, that has also greatly enhanced the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because back in Hudson Taylor's day, you could go across a river or go over a mountain, and the dialect was nearly incomprehensible. You could not understand it. Just as an example, I can speak a dialect which is on the coast of China. It is called Fujianese, or Fujianhua. It's actually also spoken in Taiwan. There's a river in Fujian province called the Ming River, M-I-N, the Ming River. On the south of that river, they speak the dialect that I can speak. But all you have to do is step across that river, and they speak the Fuzhou dialect, which is, from my perspective, entirely incomprehensible. I cannot understand even a word of it. And so that was the day and age in which Hudson Taylor lived. And so they needed different translations of the Bible. And let me just pause there as well, because I think that brings out an important reminder for us as well. And it is simply this. In missiology, we speak of the translatability of the Christian faith. Now, that's a word that is made up by missiologists. The translatability, that is not in the Webster's dictionary or in the Oxford dictionary. But what we simply mean by that is the Christian faith can be translated into different languages. It can be translated into different cultures. Incidentally, it's actually something which makes Christianity a very unique faith amongst the some 9,000 religions in the world. There is no other religion, to my knowledge, that is as translatable as the Christian faith. And even the other largest faith or religion, Islam, the Quran, the official Quran is in Arabic. And you can have different translations, but they are only in reference. You cannot use them as the legitimate translation. But in the Christian faith, we have what we call the translatability. And that's such a powerful thing from my perspective. That the gospel of Jesus Christ can be translated and spoken into each and every culture. Well, Hudson Taylor was involved in the translation of the Ningbo Bible. And I didn't bring a copy of that with me to show you this afternoon, because the copy that I have is about falling. I need to find somebody to help me repair it. But it's an amazing thing of the work that they were able to do. But then just very quickly, the third thing, obviously, that he was able to do, that is Hudson Taylor, was to bring a focus to the English church, the church in England, on the needs, the spiritual needs of China. And over those 4 or 5 years, what Hudson Taylor did was over and over again. He went to different churches, he went to different conferences to speak about the needs of the some 300 million Chinese that were in China. Incidentally, there's 1.3 billion Chinese in China today, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But in Hudson Taylor's day, there was 300 million Chinese. And that's what weighed on his heart tremendously. What I did bring along is a copy of the first book that Hudson Taylor wrote. It actually was published in 1865. And it was a book that he, together with Maria, put together. It's entitled China, Its Spiritual Need and Claims. Kenneth Latourette, probably one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, said that this book was probably only second to William Carey's book in 1793 on the inquiry of the heathen or the pagans to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. This book was second to Carey's small booklet that impacted the church in that day. Well, in this book, Hudson Taylor explores the spiritual needs of China. And one of the phrases that he brings out over and over again is a phrase that should also resonate with our hearts today. And I pray that it will even more resonate with our heart. And it's simply this. The phrase that Hudson Taylor used over and over again as he thought of those 300 million Chinese was that they were racing to a Christless eternity. Racing to a Christless eternity. Well, in the process of writing this book, his health nearly failed. And he was invited by a dear friend by the name of William Berger to go down to Brighton, which is in the southern part of England. It's on the coast. And Hudson Taylor found himself in that city on June 25th, 1865. It was a joy for Mimi and I, as well as my mother and other family members, actually, to be on that very beach, not in 1865, but in 2015. And I actually brought a little can of stones that I collected from Brighton Beach as a memorial, not only of that day, just by way of more of a personal note. Actually, for us, our family, that day had an added significance because our youngest daughter, Joy, was also baptized off of Brighton or on Brighton Beach that day as well. And so we can double celebrate that day from henceforth. But Hudson Taylor found himself in Brighton on June 25th. It was a Sunday. And he went to hear a Reverend Dennison. I've not been able to find anything more except his name. Reverend Dennison. At a Presbyterian church, which incidentally now is a restaurant/bar in Brighton. There were about 1,000 people worshiping there. Let me just read for you what Hudson Taylor wrote in his diary describing what came through or what went through his heart and his mind as he worshiped there and subsequently what took place. This is what he said. He said he was unable to bear the sight of a congregation of 100 or more Christian people rejoicing in their eternal security, while millions in China were perishing for lack of spiritual knowledge. He goes on to say, I wandered onto the sands alone, and I couldn't find any sands. I found a lot of rocks. He said, I wandered onto the sands alone in great spiritual agony, and there the Lord conquered my unbelief. I love that phrase. There the Lord conquered my unbelief, and I surrendered myself to God for this service. I told him that all the responsibilities as to the issues and consequences, that is of starting a mission agency, all the issues and consequences must rest with him, and that as his servant, it is mine to obey and to follow him. His, that is God, to direct, to care for, and to guide me, and those who might labor with me. He goes on to say, need I say that peace at once flooded into my burdened heart? There and then I asked him for 24 fellow workers, 2 for each of the 11 inland provinces of China, which were without a missionary, and 2 for Mongolia. This is actually the Bible that Hudson Taylor had with him that day, 1865. And in this Bible, he recorded that simple prayer. 24 willing and skillful workers for China. 24 skillful workers for China. Well, that's a little bit of the background for those who might not know and be as familiar with it and Hudson Taylor. Well, from there, I'd just like to very quickly, in the moments that follow, share with you 5 things that I think are significant. They were significant in Hudson Taylor's day, but they are also equally significant to us in the 21st century as well. As I have read and reread that history, the first thing that obviously comes to mind is the passion that Hudson Taylor, as well as these early missionaries, had for the unreached. Passion. Do you remember Luke's description of Paul in Athens in Acts chapter 17? You remember he goes there and he's waiting for Timothy and he's waiting for Silas and he sees Athens, actually the intellectual capital of the world in that day and age. And he sees Athens and he sees the idols. Actually, Luke tells us that the city was filled with idols. Historians tell us actually there were more idols than there were people in Athens. And the word that Luke uses to describe Paul is simply this, that his heart was anxious. His heart was perplexed. He had a passion for lost souls. He had a passion for God's glory. And that passion comes through as we read the life and the testimony of those early missionaries, of Hudson Taylor. I've talked about the book that he wrote, China, Its Spiritual Need and Claims. And that phrase, racing to a Christless eternity. And maybe somebody can help that gentleman so we can make sure. You okay? There we go. Thank you very much. Take your time. It was a passion for lost souls. As he thought of those Chinese, 300 million, many of them who were the inland parts of China, without any access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he was anxious for their souls, and he was desirous that they would receive the gospel of Jesus Christ. There was an incident that he actually goes on to read, that he records. Some of you might be familiar with it if you've read his biography. He was actually in the vicinity of Shanghai preaching, and after he had preached, a young man came up to him and said, Teacher Taylor, I'd like to ask you a question. How long has this gospel been in your country? How long has this gospel been? Well, before Hudson Taylor had a chance to answer this question, this young Chinese man went on to say, actually, my father spent his entire life searching for this truth that I've heard today. He sought it in animism, he sought it in Buddhism, he sought it in Taoism, and he sought it in Confucianism. He did not find it. He said, not only did my father spend his whole life searching and not finding it, my grandfather as well. How long have you had this gospel in your country? Hudson Taylor responded by saying, the gospel had been in England for several hundreds of years, to which this young man said, why have you taken so long to come? Why have you taken so long to come? My friends, I believe that will be the cry of many around the world today as well. Actually, within OMF, one of our focuses is upon the unreached, especially of Asia, whether they are found in Asia or even beyond Asia. Inasmuch as we believe migration has brought Asians to many parts of the world. And one of our focuses is on the unreached people groups of Asia. Let me just very quickly highlight several of them that I think are so strategic for us in the 21st century to refocus an effort upon. Obviously, the largest unreached people group in the world today is the Muslim world. 1.6 billion Muslims in the world today. I personally believe that they represent the largest challenge for the Christian church and the Great Commission in the 21st century. And it behooves us to understand even more Islam to get beyond our fears and our prejudices, and to seek to understand Islam, to understand the worldview of Islam, to understand the religion of Islam, to think through what are some bridges in which we can develop in reaching this group of people for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just within Asia alone, many countries have large Muslim populations. China, some 25 million Muslims in China alone. One of the focuses that we have within the fellowship today is upon the Hui of China. Seeking to find ways in which we can make friends with these Hui people. Finding ways in which we can see the gospel brought into their midst. And right across Asia, not only just in China, but we think of places like southern Thailand. We think of places like Indonesia, which incidentally, if you don't know, is the largest Muslim populated country in the world. It's not Saudi Arabia. And thinking through how can we see the gospel brought to these people of hard soil. And I believe that that's one of the greatest challenges. Not only the unreached people of Islam, but also the unreached people of China. 1.3 billion Chinese. While we thank God for the growth of the church in China, many tell us that there are probably close to 100,000 Christians in China today. Thank you very much. There we go. It's always good to have experts down there to keep me in line. 100 million, I think that probably figure's a bit too high, but anyway, we won't belabor the point today. But even if there was 100 million Christians in China today, let us not forget that there's still 1.2 billion who need the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me just put it in a mathematical equation that I hope can be a bit more helpful for us to understand what 1.2 billion people represent, because at least I do not have $1.2 billion in my bank account. What does 1.2 billion people represent? Well, just imagine with me if 5 Chinese were to walk past us, walk across this stage per second. 5 Chinese. Do you know how long it would take for 1.2 billion Chinese to walk across this stage? Well, if my math is correct, and I did it correctly, I should say. If I did it correctly, it would take us probably close to 8 years before that 1.2 billion Chinese would cross the stage. A tremendous opportunity. Incidentally, let me quickly just add that Asians are not found in Asia alone. They are also found even here in this country, even here in this state, even here in this city. And we actually have a wonderful opportunity of reaching out to Chinese that God, via His invisible hand, has brought to our shores. And diaspora ministry is such a strategic opportunity for us. And even with OMF, we have identified diaspora ministry. That is reaching people outside of their home countries as a very strategic work to be involved in. Because often it is easier to reach them outside of their countries with the gospel of Jesus Christ than it is to reach them inside of their countries. Recently we were invited by a church, an African church, in Kenya, to partner together with them to reach out amongst the Chinese in Kenya as well as right across Africa. Statistics tell us that there are probably close to 3 million Chinese in Africa alone. That's the official number, and most of the time the official number is about half of what the unofficial number really is. And I'll never forget what that Chinese pastor said to our colleagues in that invitation. He simply said this: can you come and help us learn to reach out to these Chinese in Kenya, because our desire is that they do not get the curse of AIDS while they're here in Africa, but rather they get the blessing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the Lord has opened up a wonderful door for us to be involved in outreach work there in Kenya. Actually, one of our colleagues goes to a local prison, believe it or not. The Kenya Police Department came to us because the Kenya Police Department doesn't speak Chinese. They came to one of our colleagues, a couple from Malaysia, and said, can you come to the prison once a week to visit these Chinese prisoners and to help us translate for them? And a wonderful door of ministry has been opened up. Well, the Chinese world. The third largest people group, the unreached people group in Asia, is the Buddhists. About 1 billion Buddhists in China. Just recently I heard a colleague share. He was visiting Thailand, actually the eastern part of Thailand, which is predominantly Buddhist. And after driving 5 hours, an OMF colleague finally stopped the car and turned to my friend and simply said this, that over these 5 hours of driving, we have gone through town after town, village after village. In those 5 hours, in that 5-hour radius, there is not one Christian church to be found. Not one Christian church to be found. Passion for the lost. And I believe, brothers and sisters, that we need to ask the Lord to renew our passion. Amen. To renew our passion for the lost. Well, the second word that comes to mind in addition to passion is prayerful dependence upon God. Prayerful dependence upon God. And there are many stories that come to mind for Hudson Taylor. I actually brought a publication that OMF puts out. It's no longer called China Millions. It's called Asia Billions, but this is the British copy, and so they still stay with millions rather than billions. But on this, and you won't be able to see it as clearly, I apologize for that, there are 2 like seeming Chinese scrolls containing Chinese characters. And these 2 are the watchwords of OMF. One is 耶和华以勒, which simply translates into English as Jehovah Jireh. And of course, we're familiar with that phrase because that is found in Genesis chapter 22. You remember where Abraham obediently took his son up to the mountain where God had led, to Mount Moriah. And you remember he sacrificed his son, or he started to do that, and then a voice stopped him, and an angel prevented him from harming that boy. And there on the mountain of God, Abraham experienced God's faithfulness, God's provision. And actually, this word Jehovah Jireh simply means that on God's mountain, God will provide. While the other word is Ebenezer, 以便以谢. It is found actually from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 7, where it speaks of that Jesus, or God actually, is our banner. And he is leading us forward. He is leading us forward. And he has been our help all along the way. And those are the 2 watchwords, catchwords of OMF, as well as the CIM. Hudson Taylor once said an interesting thing. He said that we don't need a great faith, but rather we need faith in a great God. And as we walk in his will, just as Abraham walked in God's will, that God will provide. God will meet all of our needs. Stories that I can share this afternoon of God's faithfulness. But let me just share one of my greatest stories, my fondest stories of Hudson Taylor. This was actually on his first visit to the United States. He was invited by Dwight Moody, who you remember is one of the greatest evangelists of the 19th century. And he was invited to the Moody Church there in Chicago. I don't know how many of you have visited Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, but the chapel or the church is there. And Hudson Taylor was invited to speak at Moody's church. Well, the CIM was set up on what we call non-solicitation policy. And simply that means that we do not take up an offering. We do not ask for funding or people to give money. We depend upon God. We trust that God's work done in God's way will not lack God's provision. And so Hudson Taylor shared with Moody, indicating that the CIM had a non-solicitation policy. And so if it would be okay with Moody, would it be all right if no offering was taken up at the end of this meeting? Moody, being an American, thought this was the most ridiculous thing that anyone could ever come up with, but he honored his British guest and said, okay, we won't take up an offering. Well, at the end of the service, and we've never been able to figure out what exactly Hudson Taylor preached on, but at the end of the service, Moody got up after Hudson Taylor finished, and he proceeded to break his promise. And he said, I believe that the best response you and I can have today is to take up an offering for the China Inland Mission. Well, Hudson Taylor was not a big person. He was probably only up to my shoulder, maybe a little bit higher than that. Well, Moody was a fairly large man. But here was this British man that jumped back up on stage and looked at the American in his face and told him, Mr. Moody, you promised me that we would not take an offering. Please hold to your promise. Well, you can imagine the awkwardness of the moment, but Moody backed down, and so that was the end of the service. But it wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, Hudson Taylor was packing up. He was on his way to St. Louis, I believe. And there was a knock on the door. He opened the door, and an American pushed an envelope into his hand. And he did something, actually, from a Chinese perspective, which is very, very uncharacteristic. He actually opened up the envelope right in front of this person. And lo and behold, in that envelope was a check for $5,000 US. Now, do remember that, well, even today, 5,000 is a chunk of change. But 130 years ago, that was a huge chunk of change. And Hudson Taylor thought, well, maybe there's a mistake here. Please, what happened here? And this young American man went on to explain that he was actually at the church the day before. And he said to Hudson Taylor, if you would have taken an offering, or if an offering was taken yesterday, the most I would give was $5. And he went home. And he said he couldn't sleep that night. And there was a voice that over and over again asked him this question, is my salvation only worth $5? Well, of course, it isn't. It's worth much more than that. And it developed into a bargaining between this man and God. He said, well, if I gave him $50, would that be okay? Is my salvation worth $50 alone? No, well, but if I give him $500, is that okay? And it went back and forth until he finally got up, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote a check for $5,000. And he said only then could he go to bed. Well, of course, we know that God's salvation is worth even more than $5,000. But that was what God wanted him to give. My friends, our God is a faithful God. And I stand here as a living testimony of his faithfulness throughout the generations. And as long as you and I are found in God's will, found on God's mountain, found in the place where God directed us, he will meet not our wants, but he will meet all of our needs. And there is a difference between those things, there not. Prayer and experiencing God's faithfulness. Well, the third P that comes to mind, in addition to passion, in addition to prayer, is pioneer. Pioneer. And I wish I had more time to talk about this, but just highlight maybe some things very quickly. Hudson Taylor, as well as the early CIMers, were great at contextualization. And what I mean by that is, after Hudson Taylor got to China, he quickly found that wearing Western clothing was an unnecessary inhibitor to the Chinese accepting the gospel of Jesus Christ. Actually, for many years, there was a saying that went across China, and simply this: one more Christian, one less Chinese. But it does not need to be so. Hudson Taylor's breakthrough actually came on a rather humorous note, because he was preaching in one place, and he had on an English jacket of some sort with 2 buttons in the back of this jacket. And as he was speaking, he noticed a Chinese young man not listening so much to what he had to say, but rather he was intrigued by these 2 buttons on the back of Hudson Taylor's suit jacket. And so when Hudson Taylor finished, this is what this young man said to Hudson Taylor: "Honorable teacher, can I please ask you, what are those 2 honorable buttons doing on the back of your honorable coat?" Well, Hudson Taylor didn't know how to answer that question. It would be something similar to you asking me, "Jamie, what are these 4 buttons doing on your sleeve coat? And to this day, I have never been able to answer that question. I have no idea what these 4 buttons are there for. I remember one time I was sharing this illustration and somebody came up afterwards and said, that's so easy. If you lose a button in the middle, you have quite a few that you can bring over to them. Well, except the sizes are so much different. But Hudson Taylor realized that what he was wearing was an unnecessary inhibitor to the Chinese hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he did something radical. Actually, incidentally, if you know the CIM history, you'll know that it earned a nickname because of this. It was called the Pigtail Mission. And the reason it was called the Pigtail Mission was all the men had to wear queues. And actually, I did not bring a strand of Hudson Taylor's hair with me this time, but I could do that and show you. He grew a queue, which was customary in that day and age of the Qing dynasty. Contextualization. And that continues to be a tremendous challenge for us on the mission field today as well. But let me quickly add, don't think that it's only the mission field that it is important. Actually, in American society, contextualization is so important as well. And one of the reasons I personally believe, at least within the Chinese church context, and that's what I'm more familiar with, and so if you're not from that background, please forgive me, but one of the challenges of the Chinese church here in the United States is contextualization, and simply meaning that there is a disengagement of the second generation to the Christian faith, because the first generation insists on worshiping God in their way, and insisting the second generation also worship God in their way. And over again, I have used 2 illustrations to remind the Chinese church, and maybe perhaps a reminder for us this afternoon, of the importance of contextualization even here in the American society. You remember John's record of Jesus and his evangelism in the Gospel of John? If you have a chance, go back and read John chapter 3 and John chapter 4. There in chapter 3, Jesus speaking to Nicodemus. There in chapter 4, Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman. I will put before you that the message did not change, but the method was radically different. The message did not change, but the method was radically different. He did not say to the Samaritan woman, you must be born again. She would have thought he was out of his mind. What did he say instead? I have living water. And anyone who drinks of this water will never thirst. What a wonderful example of contextualization. For you remember that that woman went to the well to draw water. And Jesus contextualized the method to reach the heart of this woman. Well, the other example, obviously, is Paul in the in the Acts. Go back and, if you get a chance, to read Paul's sermons. For instance, in chapter 13, where he is in a synagogue preaching, speaking to Jews, and over again, reference to the Old Testament. But then skip over to chapter 17, a passage that we've already alluded to this afternoon. Speaking to Gentiles, speaking to Greeks, speaking to Athenians. And there you will find not one reference to the Old Testament. But the message was still the same. Jesus Christ and his cross, his resurrection. Contextualization, a powerful thing for us even in this day and age, both on the mission field as well as within the more North American and American context, and even here in Seattle. Well, the second thing that I think was very pioneering for Hudson Taylor, not only in terms of contextualization, but of mobilization. And just very quickly, 2 things that come to mind. One is that he mobilized laity for missions. He mobilized laity. Not one of the early CIMers were what we would call clergy. All of them were laity. He did that very specifically because he didn't want to compete with existing mission agencies. He didn't want to compete with mission agencies. And so he sought to mobilize laity. And so if you look at at pictures of the early CIMers, you will find not one reverend, not one pastor, not one preacher, but you will find a whole host of proclaimers in their midst. And as I've reflected upon that, that's also been such a fresh reminder as we look at missions, even in the 21st century. Actually, if we just go back to Asia alone, do you know that actually in Asia alone, nearly 2 billion people live where missionaries cannot go? We call them Creative Access Nations. CAN, CAN. Creative Access Nations. They are where missionaries cannot go. But before we think that they are closed, and I do not believe that any country is closed, even North Korea, because no country can be closed to God. They are not closed. But rather through creative ways, we can go to these places and serve. Could I just share a personal testimony that this came back to me so strongly? This happened actually just about 20 years ago. Mimi and I, our whole family, moved to Hong Kong in 1996, and we became involved in a ministry of mobilizing Christian professionals to serve in the southwest part of China. Mobilizing English teachers, mobilizing medical practitioners, wonderful avenues in which to be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, I was asked by colleagues to go to a city there in that part of China, to go to a school to explore possibilities of partnering together with them, to send medical practitioners, to send English teachers to this school. This school was a very special school. It was a Communist Party school for medical continuing education. If you're familiar with the medical profession, you know that most practitioners, medical practitioners, have to take classes every year in order to maintain their medical licenses. And so this school was set up, and specifically it was set up to train Communist Party medical practitioners. I felt a bit like Daniel in the lion's den the morning I went to the school to talk to the principal. I walked in, I sat down, very courteous time together, but before very long, he stopped me dead in my tracks with this simple question. Mr. Taylor, I just want to ask you one question. All the teachers, all the medical practitioners that you're going to bring to my school, are they all Christians? And I thought, that's the end of that. Because, of course, they were all Christians. And here I was in the front of a Communist Party member, for sure, in a Communist Party school. And you know, the human mind is an amazing thing. You know what darted through my mind as I sat there thinking in just split second how I'm going to answer this question? What darted through my mind was terms like religion is the opium of the masses. What darted through my mind is all of these missionaries were just the running dogs of imperialism. And these are terms that we often in the past have heard. But I had to answer the question. And so I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, Principal, yes, all of the medical practitioners, all of the English teachers we are going to bring to this school are Christians. I truly thought that was the end of my meeting. There is the door. Don't call us, we'll call you. But I'll never forget, my friends. He looked me back in the eye and he simply said this, good. I hope you only bring Christians to my school. 20 years ago. And right across Asia, right across the world today, believe, brothers and sisters, I believe we need to renew our focus on seeing how God wants to use your profession, how God wants to use my profession as a profession of faith. Isn't that interesting, this word profession? I always have a difficult time coming into the United States. I don't know about you. 2 days ago, Mimi and I came in, and you go through this automated system. If you've traveled outside of the country and come back, you have to scan your passport and you get back a receipt that either has a big X on it or has nothing on it. Well, I told my wife, Mimi, that I always get an X on on this slip. So I always have to have extra questions. And of course, the first question they ask me, what do you do? And I found actually the best answer is to say, I'm a missionary. That's usually the end of the discussion. I think they're afraid I'll pass them a trap if we continue much further. But I got this big X on the sheet of paper, so I had to ask several additional questions. And he asked me, what is your profession? What is your profession? But that word profession also has the meaning of declaration, does it not? And I believe, brothers and sisters, that is not by accident. But in this day and age, we are called upon to think afresh of how does God want to use your profession, my profession, in the furtherance of the Christian profession. Several years ago, I was invited to a mission conference in the Philippines, in Manila. It was an interesting conference. It was for what they call OCWs, simply standing for Overseas Contract Workers. If you're familiar with Asia, and especially the Philippines, you'll know that literally millions of Filipinos go out of the Philippines every year to work in Asia as well as beyond. And this conference was set up specifically for these people. Well, I spent 3 evenings talking to them. But I'll never forget the last evening. When I had finished, a lady came up to me. And she said, Pastor Taylor, would you pray for me? I said, okay, how can I pray for you? And she says, I'm going to somewhere you will never be able to go. I said, well, where are you going? She said, I'm going to Saudi Arabia. I said, well, I should be able to get into Saudi Arabia. She said, yeah, you could get there as a tourist, but you'll never go where I'm going to go. And I said, where are you going to go? She says, I'm going to work in the home of a Muslim. And I said, well, how can I pray for you? She said, pray that the Lord would give me courage and the Lord would give me sensitivity to be a witness for Jesus Christ in that Muslim home. Incidentally, perhaps some of you are also aware of the fact that many in the Muslim world have turned to Jesus Christ precisely because there is a Filipino maid, a Christian, using her profession as a profession of faith. And so the whole area of mobilization, an amazing thing, mobilizing the laity in cross-cultural missions. Well, quickly, another area of mobilization that seems a bit sort of out of step in this day and age, and that was the mobilization of women. And this has an interesting background because back in those days, Hudson Taylor found if China was going to be reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ, women needed to be mobilized for missions. Back in those days, the only way to get to the mission field was to marry a missionary. And you were not considered a missionary. You were only considered the wife of a missionary. But Hudson Taylor saw that it was so important to mobilize women for missions. Well, we live almost in a diametrically opposite world today where we need to mobilize more men for missions as well, do we not? There are many, many women on the mission field. Not too many, but there are not enough men on the mission field. A good friend of Mimi and I, a Chinese pastor, once told us a humorous story. He went to visit a parishioner, somebody in the church, actually, where he was speaking at. And they had a little boy, 10 or 11 years old, and this little boy saw Grandpa Morley. And he said, Grandpa Morley, can you please tell me what is the fruit of missions? Well, Grandpa Morley is a missionary, but he never thought of fruit and missions being linked together. But he thought for a while, and he thought he came up with a pretty good answer. He said, it must be passion fruit. Sounds good, right? Passion fruit. Well, that sounds... Except this little boy said, no, Grandpa Morley, that's not the right answer. Well, that's Pastor Morley or Grandpa Morley, and he gave up, and finally he said to this young boy, he said, well, what is the fruit of missions? And this little boy looked him in the eyes and he said, it is mango. Grandpa Morley still couldn't figure that one out. And so this little boy said, well, how do you spell mango? Well, we all know how to spell mango, don't we? M-A-N-G-O. Man, go. The men need to go. We need more men on the mission field, my friends. We still need women indeed, but we need more men on the mission field. And so a lot of pioneering that went on. Incidentally, he also pioneered putting the headquarters of a mission field on the mission field rather than being based in the home country. Pioneer. Just very quickly, the fourth thing that comes to mind is partnership. Partnership. And it's a wonderful opportunity for Mimi and I to be here this afternoon, conscious of the fact that Mission Fest here in the Seattle area is a product of a conviction of partnership. A desire of multiple churches to gather together, seeing the importance of partnership in the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Partnership. And that was a conviction of Hudson Taylor. Actually, the CIM, to this day, is a multi-denominational, an interdenominational mission agency. We have missionaries from right across the Christian spectrum. And we thank God for that unity that we can find, even in the midst of our diversity. One of Hudson Taylor's favorite passages, if I'm not mistaken, is John 17, Jesus' prayer prior to the cross. And you remember that prayer in which Jesus over and over again referred to the importance of unity amongst the disciples. And that unity is so important even to this day as well, as we think about missions. Missions in the 21st century, I am convinced, is about partnership, not about partisanship. It is about partnership. It is about networking, because only as we network will we increase our net worth. And I think we need to think afresh of ways in which churches can join together in the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Incidentally, just let me share actually a conviction that OMF has today, and a principle that we hold to. And that is not only partnering on the home sides, but also partnering on the field. And one of the joys that Mimi and I have had over these last few years is to partner together with China's emerging missionary movement. Some of you might be familiar with the fact that the church in China, as it has matured, has also grown in its desire to be engaged in cross-cultural missions. And it's exciting to see actually literally around the world today what we call in missiology the majority world. That is the Latino world. That is the African world. That is the Asian world. Places that used to be mission fields now have become mission forces. And within China, it's been a wonderful joy for us to journey together with the church in China as it sees and it seizes on a desire to be even more engaged in cross-cultural missions. Actually, just before coming, we had a wonderful 2-day conference in Hong Kong. Some 150 brothers and sisters from China. And I shared with them that our desire was to journey together with them. Our desire was to partner together with them, realizing that missions today is not about partisanship, but rather it is about partnership. And how we can join hands together to see the fulfillment of the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. Partnership, so important. But then very quickly, lastly, not only about passion, not only about prayer, not only about pioneer, not only about partnership, but the word that comes most to mind is simply this: the preeminence of Jesus Christ. The preeminence of Jesus Christ. Not only in the life of Hudson Taylor, but in the life of each and every one of us. Hudson Taylor once said something very simple yet very profound. It was simply this: if Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. If Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord Several years ago, I had the chance of visiting the far northwest part of China. I went to a city in the province of Gansu, the city of Lanzhou. The reason I went there was to visit an old CIM hospital. It's no longer the Gospel Hospital. It is now called the Second People's Hospital. But it began as a CIM Gospel Hospital. The afternoon I went to visit, local brothers and sisters took me to this hospital. A beautiful, brand new building, some 13, 14 stories high. But very interestingly, I don't know if the architect was a Christian or what it was, but somehow he was led to leave a one-story structure of the original hospital intact on this hospital compound. And so as you go to this hospital, you see this beautiful white building on one side, and then you see this one-story structure right beside it. And that structure was part of the original Gospel Hospital. They've renovated it, they fixed it up, but it was a wonderful experience to step into that hospital, that one-floor structure. There, as you step in, there's a corridor. And on this corridor, there's a series of pictures describing the history of this hospital, a CIM Gospel Hospital, with an intentional focus of reaching the northwest part of China among Muslims as well as among Tibetans, and using medical platforms, using medical avenues to minister their physical needs, and through that also to minister to their spiritual needs. I'll never forget seeing 3 pictures of individuals that were linked with this Gospel Hospital. The first was a Brit. His name was George King. George King. He actually was born in China. His father was George King I. He was George King II. He eventually went back to the UK for his studies and was a very outstanding medical doctor. Upon graduation, he let it be known that he felt God's call for him to go to China as a medical doctor. Many people tried to dissuade him from doing that. Many people thought he was crazy. They thought he had such a brilliant future ahead of him as a medical practitioner there in the UK. Some of his friends said to him, it would be actually more advantageous for you to stay here in England and work and make money, and you could actually support 10, you could support 15, 20 missionaries with what you're able to make. And from one perspective, that does sound reasonable, does it not? But that was not God's intention for George King. And so he put aside all of his diplomas and all of his academic rewards. And he went to China. And he went to that far northwest part of China, to that city of Lanzhou, to that Gospel Hospital, and dedicated his life. Why? Because of the preeminence of Jesus Christ. The lordship of Jesus Christ in his life. The second picture is actually a brother from China. His Chinese name is Gao Jingchen. It's okay if you don't remember that. Actually from the province of Henan, where my father was born and where my grandparents served in the Sino-Japanese War. His biography tells us that he actually met Hudson Taylor when he was a young boy. Hudson Taylor died in 1905. His dying wish, that is Hudson Taylor's dying wish, was to visit 2 provinces in China. The province of Henan and the province of Hunan, both in the central part of China. The reason why Hudson Taylor wanted to visit these 2 provinces was that he was convinced that the day he saw the gospel realized in these 2 provinces, the day he saw missionaries reside in these 2 provinces, the day he saw the church being built up in these 2 provinces, would be the day that God would call him home. And so, 1905, at the age of 73, his son took him to the province of Henan, the province of Hunan, the two most antagonistic provinces in China, the last to open the door for missionaries. He went to visit these two places, and it was on June 3rd, 1905, about 8:30 in the evening, that the Lord took Hudson Taylor. Incidentally, we're looking to the Lord to lead us in setting up a Hudson Taylor Memorial in China. An opportunity to share with Chinese of what God did in and through not only Hudson Taylor, but many, many missionaries in seeing the gospel brought to China. But it was in Henan that Hudson Taylor is reported of meeting Gao Jingchen, this young Chinese man. And all we have recorded of Hudson Taylor saying to him was simply this: "Young man, I'm waiting for you in heaven." I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's something would excite me, but anyway, that was what's recorded of Hudson Taylor saying to him, "Young man, I'm waiting for you in heaven." Well, he went on in his medical education, that is Gao Jingchen. Very successful doctor. So successful that actually he was promoted by the governor of Henan province to be what we would call the Secretary General, I think would be the term, of the entire province of Henan. One evening, Gao Jingchen had a dream. And in this dream, he heard God saying to him, "Have I saved you so that you might gain fame and wealth? Or have I saved you that you might proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ? Have I saved you that you might gain fame and wealth? Or have I saved you that you might proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ?" He goes on to say the next morning he woke up, told his wife about the dream, resigned his general's Surgeon General. He resigned his Surgeon General position, and together with his wife, who had never left that province before, went northwest and found their way to Lanzhou. And his picture stands right beside George King. Why? The preeminence of Jesus Christ. Well, the last picture perhaps is a familiar story to us. William Borden. Borden of Yale. Some of you may have read his story. An amazing story. Born in a wealthy family. His parents' high school graduation present to William Borden was a one-year expense-paid tour of the world. And that was his gap year. Wonderful gap year for young men here and women, is it not? I wish my parents gave me that kind of a gap year present. He traveled the world, and it was during that time that God began to speak to him about the needs of the northwest part of China. He came back to the United States, enrolled in Yale University, an outstanding student, did his degree in law, was voted to be the most successful person in his class. And upon graduation, he made it known that he would not stay in the United States, but rather he would go to China as a missionary. But his most known probably of William Borden is the 3 no's in his Bible. Simply this: 3 things that he desired. One is, as he followed Jesus Christ, there would be no reserve. Secondly, as he followed Jesus Christ, there would be no retreat. Thirdly, as he followed Jesus Christ, there would be no regret. No reserve, no retreat, and no regret. William Borden's picture stands beside Gao Jingchen's picture, stands beside George King's picture in Lanzhou. Second People's Hospital. Why? The preeminence of Jesus Christ. If Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. 24 willing and skillful workers. That was the prayer of Hudson Taylor. And that is the prayer I want to close this afternoon with. That in our midst this afternoon, God would raise up willing and skillful workers for the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. Father, thank you for this afternoon, for the opportunity we have had to share a bit of history, but yet also, Father, to think of its implications for us here in Seattle, here in the United States, in missions in the 21st century. And Father, as our forebearers, those who have gone before us, were faithful in their generation to your call in their lives. Lord, I pray that you would help each and every one of us here in this room to also be faithful to your call in our life. Lord, you desire willing workers to use skills that you have given to us for the furtherance of your work around the world. And so, Lord, to that end, I would pray that in our midst this afternoon, you would raise up willing and skillful workers for the furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We pray all of this